Every bill for 10 years went through an account I never had access to. I found that out the day the electricity was shut off. My husband's first call wasn't to the power company, it was to his mother, asking what I'd done. My name is Vanessa Cole. I am 38 years old, and for a decade of my marriage, I did not know how much money my own household made, spent, or owed. I want to explain how that happens to a grown woman with a college degree and a full-time job, because I used to believe it could never happen to someone like me. I was wrong about almost everything that decade. I was never wrong about the day it ended. Marcus and I met when I was 26, working at a dental office in Dayton, Ohio, doing scheduling and billing. He sold commercial insurance and had the kind of easy confidence that made everyone in a room feel like the conversation had been waiting for them. His mother, Patricia, came to our second date without either of us planning it, because Marcus had mentioned where we were eating and she happened to be in the area. I laughed about it later. I didn't know yet that Patricia did not believe in coincidences she hadn't arranged herself. We got married 2 years later in a backyard ceremony that Patricia helped pay for, which she reminded me of more than once during the planning, usually right after suggesting a change to the guest list or the flowers that I hadn't asked for. I told myself that was just what mothers did. My own mother had passed when I was 22, and some small, hungry part of me wanted a version of that closeness back, even if it came from someone else's mother instead of my own. I let Patricia fill a space I didn't fully understand I was leaving open. The finances started the way most things like this start, which is to say they started small and reasonable. About 8 months into the marriage, Marcus came home and said his mother, who had spent 30 years managing the books for his father's landscaping business before his father died, thought we should let her set up a household budget for us. She had software for it. She had a system. She had, Marcus said, offered to save us both a lot of stress. I remember exactly what I said because I've replayed it so many times since. I said that sounded helpful, as long as we still made the decisions together. Marcus said, of course. Patricia said the same thing a week later, sitting at our kitchen table with a laptop and a folder of blank spreadsheets, her reading glasses pushed up into gray hair that never seemed to move. "We still make every decision together," she said. "I'm just handling the mechanics so you two can focus on your careers and eventually a family." For the first year, it looked exactly like that. Patricia set up a joint account that our paychecks were deposited into automatically. She set up a second account, a household expense account that she funded from the joint account according to a budget she'd built. Bills got paid on time, our credit score climbed. I noticed I didn't have the login information for the household account, and when I asked about it, Marcus said his mother had set it up under her original email because that's what the automatic transfers were configured to, and changing it would mess up the whole system. I remember thinking that sentence sounded strange even as I accepted it. By year 3, I had stopped asking, not because I'd forgotten, but because every time I brought it up, it became a longer conversation than it was worth. Marcus would sigh and say his mother had been managing money since before either of us were born, and did I really want to take that away from her when she was still grieving his father? I did not want to be the daughter-in-law who took something away from a grieving widow. So I let it go, again, and told myself I would bring it up again later, when things were calmer. Things were never calmer. That is, I've learned, usually the point. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters more than the anger does. I was not a passive person in every other part of my life. I ran the front office of a dental practice with 4 dentists and 11 staff members. I negotiated vendor contracts and caught billing errors that saved the practice thousands of dollars a year. I was good at this. I was good at exactly the kind of work that was quietly being taken away from me at home, and I let it happen there in a way I never would have let it happen at my desk. I think about that contradiction more than almost anything else from that decade. It wasn't that I couldn't manage money. It was that somewhere along the way, managing our money had stopped being framed as my job, or even our job, and had become an inherited family duty that belonged to Patricia the way the good china had belonged to her mother before her. The small humiliations came in a rhythm I got used to without noticing I was getting used to it. There was the year I wanted to take a night class in medical office administration, something that would have moved me toward an office manager position, and Marcus told me Patricia had looked at the budget and said it wasn't the right year. There was the birthday I asked for a particular coat, a wool one I'd tried on twice at a store downtown and put back both times, and Marcus said he'd mention it to his mother, and I got a gift card instead, for a lesser amount, to a different store. There was the Thanksgiving Patricia mentioned, in front of both of Marcus's siblings and their spouses, that she'd had to move some things around because Vanessa's grocery spending had gotten a little ambitious that month. I sat at that table and did not say a word, because arguing about eggs and produce in front of 6 people felt smaller than the humiliation itself, and because some part of me had already decided that peace was worth more than being believed. Our first child, a daughter named Ellie, was born when I was 32. Our son, Owen, came 2 years after that. Motherhood gave Patricia a new lever to pull, because now every financial conversation could be reframed around what was best for the children, and I loved my children more than I trusted my own instincts about money, so I kept deferring. When I wanted to switch Ellie to a different pediatric dentist because our current one kept upselling unnecessary procedures, something I recognized instantly from my own job, Marcus said his mother thought switching would be disruptive and expensive. When I wanted to open a small college savings account in my own name that I controlled directly, just for peace of mind, Marcus said that was already handled, that Patricia had set something up years ago, and when I asked to see the account details, he said he'd get them from her and never did. There was one incident during those years that I think about more than the others, because it was the closest I came to breaking the pattern before the electricity ever went out. When Owen was almost 2, I totaled my old sedan in a fender bender on the way to daycare pickup. Nobody hurt, just the car itself, and I assumed replacing it would be a joint decision the way any reasonable couple would treat a major purchase. Instead, Marcus came home from a phone call with his mother and told me she had already found a used minivan through a coworker of hers, already negotiated the price, already arranged for the title transfer, and all I needed to do was show up and sign. I remember standing in our garage looking at a vehicle I had never test-driven, in a color I would not have chosen, that had apparently already been decided on my behalf before I had finished filing the insurance claim. I asked Marcus carefully whether we could have looked at 2 or 3 options together first, the way we'd talked about doing when we got married. He said his mother had gotten us a great deal and that it would be rude to unwind it now that it was already arranged. I signed the paperwork 2 days later. I told myself it was a minivan, not a hill worth fighting over. I did not yet understand that I was collecting a very long list of things that were, individually, not worth fighting over, and that the list itself was the actual problem. I also want to mention the time I brought this exact worry to a friend from work, a woman who ran the billing side of our dental office and had a marriage that looked, from the outside, almost aggressively equal. I told her, over lunch one day, that I didn't have the login to our own household account, and I watched her face do something I hadn't expected, which was not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, like she had seen this shape before in someone else's life. She asked me one question that I didn't have a good answer for at the time. She asked what would happen if Marcus and his mother ever had a falling out, or if his mother got sick, or if anything happened to her that made her unable to keep managing things. Who would actually know where anything was? I told her I'd think about it, and then, like almost everything else that decade, I let the thought sit unresolved for another few years instead of acting on it. I think the reason I stayed inside that arrangement for 10 years instead of 2 is that nothing about it looked like a single crisis. It looked like 1,000 small deferrals, each one reasonable enough on its own, each one small enough that fighting it felt disproportionate to the moment. I kept waiting for the moment that would be big enough to justify the fight. I did not understand yet that the smallness was the strategy, whether anyone had designed it that way on purpose or not. By the time something was big enough, it was also already done. The day the electricity went out was a Tuesday in March, cold enough that the house felt the loss within the first hour. I had been at work, dealing with a scheduling conflict between two dentists who both wanted the same surgical assistant on the same Thursday, and I came home to find Ellie doing her homework by the light of her phone flashlight, and Owen asking why the refrigerator had stopped humming. My first thought was a blown breaker. My second thought, walking to the panel in the garage and finding nothing tripped, was that this was not something I understood how to fix myself, which is a strange and specific kind of powerlessness for a grown woman to feel in her own house. I called the utility company from my cell phone while Ellie held a flashlight for me in the kitchen. The representative asked for the account number, and I realized I did not have it memorized, had never once paid this particular bill myself in 10 years, and had to explain that I was calling about service at my own address without being able to confirm the account. She was patient. She looked up the address and told me the balance had gone unpaid for 2 billing cycles, and that a payment plan notice had been mailed weeks earlier to an address that, when she read it back to me, was not our house. It was Patricia's condo, 40 minutes away. I stood in my kitchen holding my phone and felt something shift that I can only describe as the sensation of a floor you always assumed was solid, revealing that it had been made of something else the entire time. I called Marcus. He didn't pick up. I texted him that the power was out and it looked like an unpaid bill situation, and I needed him to call me back immediately. 15 minutes later, my phone rang, and it wasn't Marcus's name on the screen answering back to me first. It was a missed call notification telling me he'd tried Patricia twice before he called me at all, and when he finally did call, the first thing out of his mouth was not an apology and not a plan. It was a question. He asked me what I had spent that month that could have thrown things off. I want to sit with that moment for a second, because I think it's the one that changed something permanently in me, more than the dark kitchen or the cold refrigerator or even the years that came before it. My husband's first instinct, standing at the edge of a crisis that had nothing to do with me, was to interrogate my spending before he had even confirmed what had actually happened. He didn't ask if the kids were okay. He didn't ask what the utility company had said. He asked what I had spent, as if the most obvious explanation for a shut-off notice mailed to his mother's condo was something I had done. I told him, very calmly, that I hadn't spent anything unusual, that I didn't have access to the account that paid the electric bill, that I had never had access to that account, and that the shut-off notice had been mailed to his mother's house, not ours. There was a long pause on the line. Then he said he was sure there was an explanation, and that he'd call his mother and figure it out, and that we'd get the power back on tonight, and could I just keep the kids calm in the meantime? I remember standing in that kitchen, in the cold, in the dark, being asked to manage the emotional temperature of a crisis I had just learned I'd had no part in creating and no visibility into whatsoever. We got the power restored that night, paid in an emergency same-day payment that Marcus made over the phone with his mother's help, using an account number I still did not have. I put the kids to bed by flashlight and read them a story like it was an adventure, because that is what you do. And then I sat at my kitchen table after they were asleep, and I did something I had not done in 10 years of marriage. I started asking questions, and I did not stop until I had answers. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, and I spent the day going through every piece of mail I could find, every drawer, every old folder in the office closet that Patricia's system had never fully digitized. I found statements going back further than I expected, some addressed to our house, and some, I now understood, forwarded to Patricia's condo as part of the mechanics she'd set up at the beginning. What I found over the next several days, piece by piece, was not a single dramatic theft. It was a pattern, built slowly enough that no single transaction would have alarmed anyone looking at it in isolation. Patricia had, over the years, moved money between our household account and an account associated with her late husband's landscaping business, which had technically stayed open even after his death because she still did occasional consulting work through it. Some of these transfers were legitimate reimbursements for expenses she genuinely fronted, birthday gifts and holiday costs, and the kind of thing families do for each other. But a significant number were not reimbursements at all. They were loans she had made to herself, on paper labeled as household transfers, to cover a knee surgery 2 years earlier that her own insurance hadn't fully covered, a roof repair on her condo, and a car she'd bought for Marcus's younger brother when his was totaled and he didn't have the savings to replace it. Every one of these came out of an account with our names on it, using our income, without either Marcus or me ever being asked directly. My verantwoordboris ingrijm. Going through those statements taught me things about my own household that I should have known years earlier. I learned we had 2 different banks involved instead of one, because the household expense account Patricia funded had been moved once, 3 years in, from the bank Marcus and I originally opened our joint account with, to a smaller regional bank where Patricia herself had been a long-time customer since before her husband died. Nobody had told me about that move when it happened. I only found the paperwork for it in a folder labeled with the wrong year, tucked behind old tax documents in the office closet. I learned that our mortgage refinance 4 years earlier, the one I remembered signing a stack of papers for on a Saturday morning while the kids napped, had listed Patricia as an authorized contact on our escrow account, something I had apparently initialed without reading closely enough, trusting Marcus when he told me it was standard paperwork the loan officer needed for verification purposes. By the 3rd day of going through everything, I had a growing stack of statements spread across the kitchen table in date order, and I started using colored sticky notes to mark categories: yellow for confirmed household expenses, pink for anything I couldn't immediately explain, blue for anything addressed to Patricia's condo instead of our house. By the end of that day, the pink and blue notes outnumbered the yellow ones on nearly 1/3 of the pages, which is when I stopped treating this as a misunderstanding I needed to clear up and started treating it as a pattern I needed to fully document before I said a single word to anyone. I did the math sitting at that kitchen table with a legal pad because I did not yet trust myself to type it into anything that could be edited or lost. Over roughly 6 years, the transfers I could document added up to just under $31,000 that had left our household account and never come back, dressed up in a spreadsheet system designed by someone who had spent 30 years making numbers look tidy for other people's businesses. The electricity bill hadn't gone unpaid because we didn't have enough money. It had gone unpaid because the money that should have covered it had been quietly rerouted for years, and the account had finally run dry at the exact moment 2 obligations landed in the same week. I did not confront anyone that day. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy at first. It was that I genuinely did not trust my own voice not to shake in a way that would let Marcus and Patricia turn this into a conversation about my emotional state instead of the actual numbers on the page. I had watched that happen before, on smaller things. I knew exactly how it would go if I walked into that conversation without documentation, so instead I spent 4 days building a folder. I requested full statements directly from the bank, using my legal right as a joint account holder, something I hadn't known I had the standing to do until I called and asked. I printed everything. I highlighted every transfer that didn't match a household expense. I made 3 copies. I called a meeting, if you can call it that, for a Sunday afternoon when the kids were at Patricia's sister's house for a birthday party neither of us had to attend. I told Marcus I wanted to talk about the account before we did anything else about the electric bill situation, and something in my voice must have told him this wasn't going to be the conversation he expected, because he asked if I wanted his mother there too. I said yes, I wanted her there. I wanted to say everything exactly once, to both of them, in the same room, with the documentation in front of all 3 of us. Patricia arrived looking the way she always looked, composed and slightly amused, as though whatever I had to say was likely to be an overreaction she would need to gently correct. I laid the folder on the table and I did not raise my voice, because I had promised myself I wouldn't, and because I understood that calm was the one advantage I had that neither of them could take credit for or explain away. I walked through 6 years of transfers. I named the knee surgery. I named the roof. I named the car for Marcus's brother. I watched Patricia's expression change from amusement to something more careful. And I watched Marcus's face do something I hadn't seen it do in years, which was genuine surprise, not at the fact that his mother handled our money, but at the specific number sitting on the page in front of him. Patricia's first response was to call it a misunderstanding, to say that every family helps each other, and that she had always intended to pay it back, that things had simply gotten complicated after her husband died, and she hadn't wanted to burden us with the details while we had 2 small children. I let her finish. Then I said something I had practiced saying calmly, even though nothing about it felt calm inside me. I said that intending to pay it back wasn't the same as asking permission to borrow it in the first place, and that a decade of not being burdened with the details was not the same as being protected. It was the same as being kept in the dark about my own household, and I was done accepting that those were the same thing. Marcus did not defend her the way I expected him to. I think, looking back, this was the first moment in 10 years he was seeing the pattern laid out end to end, instead of experiencing it one small deferral at a time, the same way I had spent a decade experiencing it. He asked her directly why she hadn't told him about the car for his brother. He asked why the shut-off notice had gone to her address instead of ours. Patricia's answers got smaller and more defensive, and for the first time since I'd known her, I watched her run out of a smooth explanation. I told them both, that afternoon, what I needed to happen next, and I want to be clear that none of it was about revenge. I asked for the household account to be moved into an account with my name and Marcus's name only, with online access set up in both of our names that afternoon, not eventually. I asked for a written repayment plan for the $31,000, with actual dates, not vague intentions. I asked that Patricia no longer have any access to any account with my name attached to it, for any reason, permanently. I asked Marcus to sit next to me the next day when I called the bank, so he could hear, in real time, exactly how easy it actually was for 2 adults to manage their own money without anyone's mother acting as an intermediary. Marmini Pravin Molai Mengs. Patricia did not take any of this well in the moment. She said I was punishing her for trying to help. She said I was turning her son against her. She left the house without finishing her coffee, and Marcus did not go after her, which was, in its own small way, the first time in a decade he had chosen not to smooth something over on her behalf at my expense. My name to reel out Maya Septipinagents. Marcus and I sat down with an actual financial planner, someone with no family loyalty to either of us, and rebuilt our household budget from scratch, together at our own kitchen table, with both our names on every login. It was slower than Patricia's system. It was also, for the first time in 10 years, mine. I checked the balance myself. I paid the bills myself. I knew, on any given day, exactly how much money was in our account, and exactly where it had gone, and I cannot describe how strange it felt to realize that basic knowledge had been missing from my life for so long that its return felt like relief instead of routine. Patricia paid back some of the money over the following year, in smaller amounts than the repayment plan called for, and stopped entirely after about 8 months, at which point Marcus, to his credit, was the one who brought it up with her directly instead of asking me to let it go. I don't know if we'll ever see the rest of it. I've made a kind of peace with that, not because I think it was fair, but because I stopped needing the money back in order to feel like the truth had been established. The truth was established the day I laid that folder on the table. Everything after that has been about what Marcus and I choose to do with a marriage that has to be rebuilt on different terms than the ones it started on. Marcus and I are still married. I want to say that plainly, because I know it complicates the story in a way that a clean ending wouldn't. We go to counseling every other week. Some of those sessions are about money, and some of them are about the much harder question of why it took him 10 years and a dark kitchen to ask what had actually happened before he asked what I had spent. He has apologized more than once, and I believe most of those apologies, and I have also told him clearly that I will not go back to a version of our marriage where his mother's comfort takes precedence over my access to basic information about my own household. So far, he has kept that agreement. I check in with myself regularly about whether he continues to. Our counselor, a woman named Denise who specializes in couples working through financial betrayal specifically, told us early on that the money itself was almost never the whole story in situations like ours, and I resisted that idea at first because the number on the page felt like the entire story to me. She was right in a way I didn't expect. The harder work in those sessions hasn't been about spreadsheets. It's been about Marcus learning to sit with the discomfort of disagreeing with his mother out loud, instead of quietly managing both of us from opposite directions so neither of us ever had to feel the friction directly. There was one session, about 4 months in, where he admitted that he had known, on some level, for at least 2 or 3 years, that the account arrangement wasn't normal, and that he had avoided looking closely at it, because looking closely would have meant having a conversation with his mother that he didn't know how to have. Hearing him say that out loud was harder than the folder full of statements had been, because it meant the not knowing hadn't been entirely accidental on his end either. We also had a session where Denise asked me directly whether I trusted Marcus now, and I told her the honest answer, which is that I trust the version of him that showed up after the folder was on the table more than I trust the version that existed before it. That's not the same as full trust restored. It's something closer to trust on a shorter leash, renewed in smaller increments, based on what he actually does instead of what he says he intends to do. He has not complained about that arrangement, which I've come to see as its own small piece of evidence. My husband's plate is hamamdin aldin, tanamina as msido, periveras and abound the madon sworosinap. I see her at holidays, briefly, and we are polite to each other in the specific way that people are polite when a real conversation would take longer than either of us is willing to spend on it right now. My children still know their grandmother. They do not know the details of what happened, only that grown-ups had a disagreement about money, and that the house runs differently now, with 2 names on everything instead of a system nobody could quite explain to them. I think about that 15-minute gap the most, the time between when I texted Marcus about the power and when he finally called me back after trying his mother twice. I've asked myself many times whether that gap was really about protecting her, or whether it was simpler than that, just a decade-old habit of turning toward her first in any moment of uncertainty, with me somewhere further down the list of people whose account of events he trusted by default. I don't fully know the answer. I know that the gap is closed now, because I made sure it had to be, and because he has had to prove in small daily ways that it stays closed. If you've ever handed over something as basic as knowing your own bank balance because it seemed like the reasonable thing to do at the time, I don't think you were naive. I think you were trusting people who told you, in 100 small, reasonable-sounding ways, that trust and access were the same thing. They are not. I learned that lesson in a dark kitchen with a flashlight in my daughter's hand, and I would rather have learned it there than not learned it at all. So here's what I keep coming back to, because I think about it more than I probably should. If the person you married turns to someone else first, every single time, before he even asks you what actually happened, at what point does that stop being loyalty to his mother and start being a plain answer about whose account he actually trusts?